This is Tony UV with VerSprite, talking about RACI models and threat models. A RACI model is a model that shows who's responsible for what during any given type of process, and threat models is a model of threats. Oftentimes in threat modeling, there are many parties that are not included to the threat modeling party. And I'm here to talk about some exciting news that VerSprite has done in order to put forth a pretty comprehensive artifact that shows who should be involved when doing application threat modeling. You can find a lot of this information off of our GitHub page, off of the threat modeling branch that has many other types of artifacts like a retail attack tree and other types of artifacts that may be beneficial to you as a security champion doing threat modeling. Let's talk about RACI models for a second. RACI, R-A-C-I, is an acronym that is meant to denote who is responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed as part of an effort. In threat modeling, there should be a lot of different stakeholders that can contribute across those 4 different levels of responsibility. Now, in risk-centric threat modeling, especially with PASTA, the process for attack simulation and threat analysis, unlike other approaches, we realize that the security of software doesn't just rely on the code itself. It also relies on the design, the infrastructure, and the platform or the frameworks that it's running on. Oftentimes when you see a lot of threat modeling conversations, they're not really factoring in all these different other components, and especially the people that are having jurisdiction or stewardship over those technologies or efforts. So for example, oftentimes in threat modeling, especially doing one exercise, which is data flow diagramming, you have a collection of developers that sit in a war room and start to call out call flows or data flows that are part of the software model. But where are the architects? What about the engineers? What about the business analysts or even project managers that are involved early on in defining requirements for the business on what that software or product is going to look like? This is why it's so important to make threat modeling, application threat modeling, to be very collaborative and to be an effort that many people can come to the table on. So we at VerSprite developed a RACI model. And as you'll see in this RACI model, you'll see engineers, you'll see network professionals, you'll see developers, architects. So important to have architects involved, business analysts, project managers, security champions, pen testers, quality assurance engineers, because they all have some level of involvement. For example, beginning with the latter, quality assurance engineers have typically focused on functional testing. Well, many of them are now having the opportunity to run security unit tests, especially as part of a sprint. And this becomes really important because now you get your existing QA engineer to be able to run some security scripts that are developed maybe by a DevSecops group. Speaking of DevSecops, where can we use DevSecops engineers? Where should we introduce some level of automation or maybe some for both testing and or evidence collection? Let's talk about threat intel. Let's talk about vulnerability aggregation. Whatever workflows that we can automate in order to get vulnerability information into our threat model and correlate it in automatically would be ideal. So a DevSec engineer would be able to take vulnerability assessment efforts, try to introduce automated workflows to run those scans, parse those scans, apply any level of business logic filtering, correlation to other types of taxonomies like CAPEC or risk prioritization values, so that they can funnel its way into a threat model. Having a list of vulnerabilities or weaknesses is important because it makes up a weakness or vulnerability library. I've oftentimes said it that threat modeling is a marriage of libraries, and having data that is up to date and the latest and greatest in terms of vulnerabilities or weaknesses for a given application scope or overall boundary is super important. So having the DevSecops engineer involved in an overall threat modeling effort becomes super important. There are more obvious roles that can be used in threat modeling, RACI models. The most important one that oftentimes gets overlooked is the architect. The architect is responsible for architecting the overall design and the overall patterns to be used and abided by the software product. And many developers are not architects, and they're simply focused on developing software that relates to their modular component of the overall product. The architect has a responsibility of seeing a lot of things, understanding what types of possible permissions, roles, data flows, requirements by the business that should be supported for the overall application model. Not inviting the architect is a major oversight. And in many threat modeling activities and methodologies, you don't have the inclusion of the architect referenced at all. With a risk-centric approach, it's almost required not only to have the architect, but many of these other types of roles to partake. Now, it's not an obligation to have all of this community of individuals sit around and build a threat model, because that obviously would be very time consuming. But whenever possible, in order to get either byproducts from each of these constituents' roles and responsibilities to be used and leveraged, or to get their direct input, would be greatly appreciated into the threat model. The overall participation of some of these individuals, by some of these individuals makes for a better threat model. The better the input, the better the values that go into understanding flows, understanding dependencies, understanding the attack surface, understanding threats, or threat intel, advisories. There's so many pieces of information that can be derived by individuals in security operations and engineering and development in other groups. And this is why the RACI model has been developed by VerSprite and is now made available to you for download off of the GitHub page. Feel free to check it out, post comments, ask questions, and let us know how we can make a better version 2 of it. The most important thing to understand is that everyone that's listed in the RACI model can have very limited involvement in actually building the threat model. Not everyone has a responsible or accountable level in threat modeling activities. Some of them are informed, some of them are consulted. So this drastically reduces the amount of time and involvement of these people into collaborating and building an effective threat model. This is Tony UV from VerSprite signing off.